When the first Type 95 Hago tanks rolled toward the American positions in the pre-dawn darkness of June 16, 1944, their crews weren't heading into combat. They were driving into their own graves. The Marines heard them first, the distinctive whine of Mitsubishi diesel engines growing louder through the volcanic ash and jungle undergrowth of Saipan. Then the grinding of steel treads on coral, 3-man crews inside each tank, standing at their posts, confident in 12 millimeters of steel armor that had protected them through year of war in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. Then came a sound that shouldn't have been possible, the metallic ping of 50 caliber machine gun bullets striking armor, not deflecting, penetrating, going straight through. By sunrise on June 17th, those who survived would understand a terrible truth. They had been sent to fight the world's greatest industrial power with equipment designed for a war that no longer existed. But how did it come to this? The story begins not with defeat, but with a problem that seemed unsolvable. In July 1933, the Japanese Imperial Army faced a dilemma that threatened their entire vision of modern warfare. Their main battle tank, the Type 89, could only manage 15 miles per hour. This was adequate for supporting infantry moving at a walking pace through the rice paddies and mountain passes of China. It was utterly inadequate for the mechanized warfare that military planners around the world were developing. Japanese strategists had watched with interest as other nations fielded faster, more mobile armored forces. They envisioned tanks that could keep up with motorized infantry transported by truck at 40 miles per hour, navigate the varied terrain of Manchuria and China, and be produced in quantities that Japan's industrial base could actually sustain. The specifications issued by the Army Technical Bureau that July were carefully calculated. A tank weighing approximately 7 tons, mounting a 37-millimeter gun, achieving speeds of 40 kilometers per hour, with armor sufficient to resist rifle and machine gun fire from the enemies they expected to fight. Most importantly, it would be simple to manufacture and maintain. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract, and engineer Tomiohara took on the challenge. He had already earned recognition for his work on the Type 89, but this new design would push Japanese engineering in a different direction. His most notable innovation was the bell crank suspension system, a mechanically simple yet effective design that would become standard on Japanese tanks for the next decade. The system absorbed shocks well, allowing the tank to traverse rough terrain that would stop other vehicles cold. By June 1934, Mitsubishi completed the first prototype. During field trials conducted in Manchuria and at proving grounds across Japan, military observers watched with satisfaction as the tank exceeded expectations. It was genuinely fast, reaching 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and maintaining 25 to 30 kilometers per hour cross-country. Its turning radius seemed impossible for a tracked vehicle of its size. The suspension, with its distinctive bell crank design, handled rough terrain effectively, and it proved mechanically reliable, powered by a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder, air-cooled diesel engine producing 120 horsepower. The diesel engine was a particular point of pride for Japanese engineers. Unlike gasoline-powered vehicles, tanks running on diesel were less vulnerable to fires when hit. Diesel fuel was also more readily available throughout Japan's expanding empire, particularly in areas like Manchuria and Southeast Asia, where gasoline supplies were limited. The engine could run for 8 to 10 hours on its internal fuel capacity of 34 gallons, giving the tank an operational range of approximately 130 miles on roads. But the trials revealed problems that the engineers addressed with mixed success. The suspension had a tendency to pitch violently on rough ground, making accurate aiming while moving nearly impossible and causing debilitating crew fatigue during extended operations. Engineers added braces to connect the bogie pairs, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. The modification helped, but it did not completely eliminate the rough ride that would characterize the Hago throughout its service life. In 1935, at a meeting in the Army Technical Bureau, the Type 95 was formally presented as the potential main tank for mechanized infantry units. The infantry representatives voiced immediate concerns. 12 millimeters of armor, they argued, was insufficient for a tank that would be supporting infantry assaults against fortified positions. The cavalry representatives countered that the improved speed and mobility compensated for thin armor, and that the tank's firepower was adequate for its intended role. After considerable debate, with both sides presenting calculations about expected threats and operational requirements, the infantry agreed to accept the design. The Type 95 Hago was officially adopted. The designation came from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2595th year since the legendary founding of Japan. Only the last 2 digits were used in the type number. Production began at Mitsubishi facilities in 1936. The Hago was indeed a small tank. It measured just 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall. In practical terms, a man of average height could look over the turret. The weight came in at 7.4 tons for the basic tank, reaching 1 tons when loaded with crew, fuel, and ammunition. The armor was thin by any standard, 12 millimeters at its thickest points on the turret and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the roof and floor, 6 millimeters in some less critical areas. Japanese designers had calculated this was sufficient to stop rifle and machine gun bullets at combat ranges. They were designing for the enemies they expected to fight. Chinese forces with limited anti-tank capability and light Soviet tanks that might be encountered in border skirmishes. Inside, the tank was cramped in ways that American tankers, who would later examine captured examples, found almost incomprehensible. The crew consisted of only 3 men. The driver sat in the front left of the hull with severely limited vision through a small viewport and periscope. A hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right, operating a Type 97 7.7 millimeter machine gun mounted in a ball mount that allowed limited traverse. But the commander occupied the most punishing position in perhaps the entire Imperial Japanese Army. He stood alone in the turret with no seat, no turret basket beneath his feet, working in a fighting compartment with barely 50 cubic feet of space. His responsibilities were physically impossible for one person to execute effectively, yet this was the design that went to war. The commander had to command the tank, directing the driver through hand signals or shouted orders and attempting to communicate with other tanks. Only one tank in 4 had a radio set, leaving the others to follow visual signals that could be obscured by smoke, terrain, or the chaos of combat. He had to operate the main gun, a Type 94 37mm cannon capable of firing both high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. He had to load that gun, a physical task made difficult by the cramped space and the need to remain standing while doing so. Ammunition was stored loosely throughout the fighting compartment, with 130 rounds creating obstacles to movement and fire hazards if the tank was penetrated, and he had to operate a second machine gun mounted in the rear of the turret facing roughly the 5 o'clock position. The turret rotated by hand crank, requiring significant physical effort. There was barely room to move, let alone fight efficiently. But this wasn't a failure of imagination by Japanese engineers. It was a calculated compromise born from the reality of Japan's limited industrial capacity. They could build a small, fast tank with minimal crew, or they could build fewer, larger tanks with properly distributed crew responsibilities. They chose the former, betting that mobility and numbers would compensate for individual vehicle limitations. In its intended role, against the opponents it was designed to fight, the Hago performed brilliantly. The tank first saw significant action in China starting in 1937, fighting against Chinese forces that had virtually no armor and severely limited anti-tank weapons. The Hago was devastating. Its 37mm gun could destroy fortifications and suppress infantry positions. Its machine guns cut down troops in the open. Its mobility allowed it to exploit breakthroughs and pursue retreating forces across terrain that seemed impassable. Japanese tank crews gained combat experience and dangerous confidence during these campaigns. They learned their trade in an environment where their tanks were clearly superior to anything they faced. Victory after victory reinforced a false assumption that the Hago was a genuinely capable tank suitable for modern warfare, rather than a vehicle carefully optimized for a specific limited scenario against technologically inferior opponents. On December 22, 1941, Hago tanks participated in the first tank-versus-tank battle between Japan and the United States in the Pacific Theater. Fighting against American M3 Stuart light tanks near the beaches of the Philippines, the Hago crews achieved success, destroying one M3 during the initial engagement. This victory was celebrated as proof of the Hago's capability. The fact that the M3 Stuart had 32 millimeters of armor on its turret sides compared to the Hago's 12 millimeters seemed irrelevant in the flush of tactical success. But there had been a warning. one that was observed and then systematically ignored. In 1939, at a place called Khalkin Gol along the Mongolian border, Japanese forces had clashed with the Soviet Union in a series of escalating border incidents. On July 2nd, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment, equipped primarily with Type 95 tanks, launched an attack against Soviet positions. The initial assault achieved some success through aggressive tactics and surprise. Japanese tanks destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles. Japanese commanders sent optimistic reports back to Tokyo, but Soviet counterattacks in the following days told a different story. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks mounted 45mm guns with significantly better armor penetration than the Hago's 37mm weapon. Soviet armor was thicker, making frontal engagements difficult and often suicidal for Hago crews. The battles were brutal. The Hago's thin armor, which had been adequate against Chinese rifles, proved vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank weapons and tank guns. Japanese crews discovered that their speed and mobility advantages meant little when enemy tanks could penetrate their armor at ranges where their own guns were ineffective. By the end of the Khalkin Gol campaign, Japanese armored forces had suffered losses severe enough that senior officers privately questioned the Hago's adequacy against modern opponents. But these concerns were overridden by continuing success in China and the spectacular early victories of the Pacific War. Confidence built on years of crushing lesser opponents proved more powerful than a few warning signs from a border conflict most Japanese military leaders preferred to forget. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, a different approach to armored warfare was taking shape. The United States was building an economy capable of waging industrial warfare on a scale that seemed impossible to Japanese planners. When the M4 Sherman medium tank entered production in 1942, it represented not just a different philosophy of tank design, but a different reality of what industrial capacity could achieve. The Sherman was larger and heavier, weighing between 30 and 35 tons, roughly 4 times the weight of a Hago. Its frontal armor measured 51 millimeters thick, angled at 56 degrees, to provide effective protection equivalent to approximately 75 millimeters against anti-tank projectiles. Where the Hago had 3 crew members with the commander performing multiple simultaneous tasks, the Sherman had 5 crew members with clearly defined specialized roles. The commander could focus on commanding, using his cupola with 6 vision blocks to maintain situational awareness and direct the crew. The gunner focused exclusively on aiming and firing the main gun, using a telescopic sight with magnification and a power traverse system that could rotate the turret quickly and smoothly. The loader focused on maintaining a high rate of fire, pulling rounds from organized, protected racks and loading them efficiently. The Sherman's 75mm gun had a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,400 feet per second with standard ammunition, giving it effective armor penetration against most targets it would face in the Pacific theater. Critically, the gun was stabilized in the vertical axis, allowing reasonably accurate fire even while the tank was moving. This was a capability the Hago completely lacked. The hand-cranked turret required the tank to stop before the commander could effectively aim and fire. Every Sherman had a radio, usually an SCR-528 or SCR-538 set, allowing tank-to-tank communication and coordination with infantry and artillery units. The Hago had radios in only 1 tank out of 4, leaving the other 3 to follow visual signals. This system broke down quickly in combat when smoke, terrain, and enemy action made visual contact impossible. But the most telling difference wasn't in the individual tanks. It was in the numbers and the industrial systems that produced them. By December 1942, the Detroit Tank Arsenal alone produced 97 Sherman tanks in a single month. This exceeded Japan's typical annual production of Hago tanks. A single American factory in a single month outproduced Japan's entire tank manufacturing capability for a year. Women who had never worked in heavy industry were welding tank hulls and assembling turrets in round-the-clock shifts. Engineers constantly improved designs, incorporating lessons learned in combat and feeding those improvements back into the production line within weeks. The supply chain delivered raw materials to factories and finished tanks to ports with clockwork efficiency. Merchant ships carried Shermans across both oceans to battlefields in Europe and Asia. Maintenance units in the field kept tanks operational, cannibalizing damaged vehicles for spare parts and returning repaired tanks to combat within days. Japan had never built this kind of industrial system. Its economy was strained by years of war in China before the Pacific War even began. Factories lacked the automation and mass production efficiency of American plants. Access to raw materials became increasingly constrained after American submarines began systematically sinking merchant shipping, cutting off supplies from Southeast Asia. By 1943, the disparity was approaching a 20-to-1 production advantage for the United States. Japanese engineers did design better tanks. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, mounting a 75mm gun, and the Type 4 Chi-To represented genuine improvements. But tank production remained a low priority compared to aircraft and naval vessels. Only between 144 and 166 Chi-Nu tanks were built during the entire war. More damningly, these better tanks were reserved for the defense of the Japanese home islands. They were never sent to the Pacific battlefields where they might have made a difference, where Hago crews desperately needed equipment that could face American armor on more equal terms. The strategic decision to hold back better tanks for homeland defense while sending Hago tanks to fight Shermans was a calculation born of desperation. But for the men who climbed into Hago tanks on Pacific islands, this strategic logic meant nothing. They were being sent to fight with equipment that was obsolete before the United States even entered the war. On June 15, 1944, approximately 15,000 U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan, an island in the Mariana Chain located 1,250 miles from Tokyo. The strategic importance of Saipan was absolute. Its capture would place America's new B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Japan's major cities for the first time. Emperor Hirohito would recognize that Tokyo itself would be bombed. The political and psychological stakes could not have been higher. Japanese defenders, including tank units equipped with Hago light tanks, prepared for the inevitable counterattack. Tank crews had confidence built on years of combat experience. They had fought in China, Malaya, the Philippines. They had faced enemy fire and survived. The 12 millimeters of armor around them had always been enough. It had to be enough. In the early morning hours of June 16th, Japanese armored units launched their counterattack. Hago tanks moved through the darkness, their diesel engines growling, tracks clanking over volcanic ash and coral. The Marines heard them coming and prepared their positions, bringing up their standard heavy weapons. Among these weapons were M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, powerful weapons designed primarily for anti-aircraft use and destroying light vehicles. What happened next would shatter Japanese confidence and rewrite the Marine Corps' tactical doctrine regarding enemy armor. As the Hago tanks came into range, Marines opened fire with their 50 caliber machine guns using armor-piercing ammunition. At close range, under 200 yards, the heavy bullets struck the Hago's armor and kept going. They punched straight through 12 millimeters of steel that Japanese crews had trusted with their lives. Bullets penetrated engine compartments, spraying oil and disabling the power plants. They penetrated sides and turrets, wounding and killing crew members who had believed themselves protected. The psychological impact on Japanese tank crews was immediate and profound. The basic premise of armored warfare, the foundational assumption that tanks protect their crews from infantry weapons, had just been invalidated. Years of training and combat experience counted for nothing in the face of this brutal reality. One Japanese tank officer captured after his Hago was disabled told his American interrogators that his first thought was that the Americans must have developed a secret weapon. He could not accept that an ordinary machine gun, a weapon that should have been incapable of penetrating tank armor, had defeated the Hago. He used the word betrayal when describing his feelings toward the equipment he had relied upon for years. The sense of shock was not tactical, but existential. If a standard infantry support weapon could penetrate his tank, then everything he had believed about armored warfare was a lie. For the Marines, the discovery represented an entirely different kind of revelation. Japanese tanks, which had seemed dangerous and intimidating based on early war reports, were suddenly just another target. Word spread quickly through the ranks. When you encounter a Japanese Hago tank, you don't need to call for anti-tank support or airstrikes or artillery, though all of those are available if needed. You can engage it yourself with your 50 caliber machine gun. At close range, under 200 yards, the armor-piercing rounds will penetrate. Aim for the engine compartment, the sides, or the turret. The bullets will go through, disabling the tank and likely killing or wounding the crew. Marine General Thomas Watson, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, declared after the battle, "I don't think we have to be afraid of tanks anymore. We've learned how to deal with them." The fear factor, the shock effect that armored vehicles were supposed to project, had evaporated. Japanese tanks had been downgraded from serious threat to manageable problem, solvable with standard equipment and basic infantry tactics. By July 9th, Saipan had fallen to American forces. The strategic consequences rippled immediately through the Japanese government. Emperor Hirohito realized that Tokyo would indeed be bombed, a prospect previously unthinkable. On July 18th, less than 2 weeks after Saipan's fall, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire cabinet were forced to resign. The defeat was so psychologically devastating, so symbolically complete, that it triggered a political collapse at the highest levels of Japanese leadership. The Hago's failure at Saipan was not an isolated incident, but a template for what would follow. On subsequent Pacific islands, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Japanese armored units adapted their tactics out of necessity rather than choice. Tanks were stripped of their mobile role and used instead as static pillboxes, buried in volcanic ash or dug into caves. This defensive adaptation was not a clever tactical evolution, but an acknowledgement of failure. Mobile mechanized warfare was impossible when your vehicles could be defeated by standard infantry weapons. Even in static defensive positions, the Hago remained vulnerable. The 50 caliber machine gun could still penetrate turret armor. American flamethrower tanks could direct streams of napalm into open hatches and vision ports, turning the Hago into what survivors called a steel coffin for its crew. At Okinawa, in the final major tank battle of the Pacific War, Japan committed 27 tanks against more than 800 American tanks. Most of the Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours, their crews dying in vehicles that could neither protect them nor allow them to fight effectively. After the war, when American engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland examined captured Hago tanks, their assessment was clinical and damning. The Hago was crude, cramped, lacking essential fire control and communication systems. The commander's workload was described as physically impossible for sustained combat. Vision equipment was inadequate. Most critically, the armor was completely overwhelmed by 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. At any range under 300 yards, penetration was assured. At closer ranges, complete perforation was the norm. Of the approximately 2,200 Hago tanks produced between 1936 and 1943, very few survive today. The thin armor that made them vulnerable in combat also meant many were completely destroyed rather than merely disabled. Those that were abandoned were often scrapped for materials in the poverty-stricken post-war period. The Hago was a defeated weapon, and defeated weapons generate less historical preservation interest than victorious designs. The M2 50 caliber machine gun, by contrast, remains in service with military forces around the world more than a century after John Moses Browning's original design. Its effectiveness at Saipan validated a design philosophy that prioritized versatility and power. The Sherman tank served through the Korean War and remained in use with various militaries well into the Cold War era, with some variants still seeing service in the 2020s. Engineer Tomiohara's name is barely remembered today, overshadowed by the comprehensive defeat of the forces that used his designs. The Hago became a symbol not of Japanese engineering capability, but of the impossible gap between what Japan needed militarily and what its limited industrial base could actually provide. The story of the Hago reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant today. Industrial capacity matters in conflicts between developed nations. Production capability determines not just quantity, but quality. The United States could produce 20 tanks for every one Japan built, but those American tanks were also individually superior in armor, firepower, crew efficiency, and battlefield survivability. No amount of courage, training, or tactical skill could overcome such a fundamental material disadvantage. Design philosophy matters. The Hago was optimized for the opponents Japan hoped to fight, Chinese forces and light Soviet tanks of the 1930s, rather than the opponents Japan would actually face. This lesson echoes in modern military procurement, preparing for the last war, or for the war you want to fight rather than the war that will actually occur, leaves forces equipped with inadequate tools when reality arrives. The danger of extrapolating from limited success remains perhaps the most insidious lesson. Hago's victories against China created false confidence that proved catastrophic when challenged by industrial peers. The tank performed exactly as designed against technologically inferior opponents, leading Japanese military leadership to believe it was genuinely capable rather than narrowly specialized. Early success can be the enemy of necessary adaptation. We see these patterns repeated today. In the Ukraine conflict that began in 2022, industrial capacity to produce ammunition, drones, and weapon systems at scale has proven determinative of outcomes on the ground. Advanced systems matter less than the ability to produce adequate systems in overwhelming quantity. This echoes the Hago situation, where Japan couldn't manufacture competitive equipment in the numbers required to matter strategically. Technology export controls imposed by advanced nations to prevent rivals from accessing cutting-edge semiconductor manufacturing mirror Japan's industrial limitations in different terms. When nations cannot build the sophisticated systems modern warfare requires, they face the same impossible strategic calculations that confronted Japan in 1944. Do you commit limited resources to a technological arms race you cannot win, or accept strategic inferiority? The psychological dimension of material failure remains relevant for modern militaries. When equipment fails to protect soldiers, when armor doesn't stop bullets, or vehicles don't withstand IEDs, the psychological trauma extends beyond physical casualties to a collapse of confidence in leadership and systems. Japanese tank crews felt betrayed by equipment that promised protection but delivered death. This same sense of betrayal has appeared in modern conflicts when soldiers discovered their vehicles lacked adequate armor for the threats they faced. The 12 millimeters of steel around a Hago tank represented a series of compromises and calculations made years before Saipan. Japanese engineers worked within the constraints they faced: limited industrial capacity, scarce resources, expected opponents with limited anti-tank capability. They created a tank that was fast, mobile, mechanically reliable, and effective within carefully defined parameters. Their failure was not one of engineering, but of strategic prediction. They designed for the war of the 1930s and sent those designs to fight the industrial war of the 1940s. When Marine Corps armorers began issuing updated field manuals after Saipan, explicitly instructing infantry on how to defeat Japanese tanks with 150 caliber machine guns, they were documenting a moment when the relationship between weapon and target had inverted. The Hago had become prey rather than predator, vulnerable rather than protected, a liability rather than an asset to the men inside it. The Japanese tank crews who climbed into their Hago tanks that morning in June 1944 believed they were going into battle with reliable, proven machines. They carried with them the confidence of years of victories and the trust built through survival. By the time the sun set on June 17th, those who survived understood a different truth. They had been sent to fight with armor so thin that machine gun bullets went straight through. They had been given equipment that was adequate for the war Japan planned to fight in the 1930s, but catastrophically inadequate for the war Japan found itself fighting in the 1940s. The outcome was never in doubt once the first 50 caliber rounds punched through steel. This wasn't a fair fight. This wasn't an even match. This was modern industrial warfare, where one side possessed overwhelming material superiority built on production capacity, technological advancement, and resource abundance that the other side simply could not match. The Hago tanks on Saipan and every other Pacific battlefield where they fought represented more than obsolete armor. They represented the consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier. Decisions to prioritize naval and air power over ground forces, to assume that fighting spirit could compensate for material inferiority, to believe that early victories against weaker opponents indicated long-term viability against industrial peers. In industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity matters, design philosophy matters, resource allocation matters. Courage matters, but it cannot overcome generational gaps in equipment quality combined with numerical disadvantages of 20-1. The truth that emerged on Saipan in those pre-dawn hours when bullets first penetrated what should have been impenetrable was simple and final. When fighting spirit meets industrial reality, reality wins every time.